because everybody is a socialist, right? You know, there's no atheists in foxholes, that there's no free market capitalists in a recession, in a stock market crash. Everybody's a socialist. Everybody wants the government to bail everybody out. I mean, the one thing that everybody is saying is that no American should have to suffer. No American should have to sacrifice. No American should lose anything because of the coronavirus. First of all, let's say this coronavirus is every bit as bad as people think. And this is going to be a major national effort, right? We have to fight off this coronavirus. And in fact, a lot of other people are saying this is like a war. A lot of politicians and people in the market are comparing it to World War II. They're saying we have to come together and we have to fight this off the same way we came together and fought World War II, right? Well, that's not what they're advocating. These guys have no idea how we came together to fight World War II. You know, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and when FDR had to go to the nation and let them know that we were going to have war with Japan and then war with Germany, FDR did not tell the public that there was nothing to worry about, that nobody was going to suffer, that nobody was going to lose their job, that everybody was going to be made whole, that nobody had to worry about paying their rent or paying their medical bills, because all this money was going to be provided by the government. They didn't say that. They said the opposite of that. You know, the reality is, and this is a reality that seems to be lost on everybody today, is that it's the people that support the government. The government can never support the people because the government gets its money from the people. So when we went to war, right, it was the people, the American people, that sacrificed to support the war effort. What happened? Government spending went up sixfold during World War II. Now, taxes tripled on the middle class. It wasn't like we just taxed the rich. You know, in 1941, only about 3% of the public paid the income tax. By 1942, 30% of the public paid the income tax. We had the victory tax in 1942. That's what introduced withholding out of your wages for the first time. It was to win the war. Right now, they're talking about a payroll holiday. We started taking money out of people's payrolls when World War II began. But it wasn't just higher taxes that the government needed. The government also called on the American public to lend it money. The government spending, as I said, increased about 6 times, but tax revenue only increased about 3 times. So there was a big gap. The national debt between 1941 and 1945 went from about $43 billion up to about $259 billion. So a $260 billion increase. 3/4 of that increase in the debt, right? $216 billion, 3/4 was from individual Americans buying war bonds. War bonds. And remember, we just came out of the Depression. We had the Depression in the 1930s, and here comes 1941, and we have World War II, and the government asks average Americans to sacrifice and pay massive taxes that they weren't paying before, and the government comes to the people and says, we need you to loan us money. Now, where did the people get all this money to loan to the government? Well, number one, they had savings, so they loaned that. But number two, they stopped spending money. What happened to the economy during World War II? Consumer spending on discretionary items collapsed. Auto sales went down 53% during the Great Depression. Spending on entertainment and recreation was down by 26%. Right? Now, why did auto sales go down? Well, I mean, first of all the automobile companies were making tanks and making Jeeps. They weren't even making any automobiles that any individuals can buy. Recreation, entertainment, I mean, 16 million men left the country and went to fight. Obviously, they're not going to bars. They're not taking their girls to restaurants. So 26% decline. Furniture sales, appliances down 24%. Even education spending went down 21%. Why? Because all the kids were fighting. They weren't going to college. But what happened to all of these businesses when this happened? right? Didn't bars and restaurants suffer when people were fighting in wars and not going out to bars and not going out to restaurants? When people weren't buying furniture? What did the furniture stores do? I mean, what were people spending their money on? I mean, they bought food. Spending on food was up 35% during the war. Why? Were people eating more food? No. Food got more expensive. That's why. That's why people spent more money on food, because food was more expensive. Same thing for medical costs. Spending on medical costs, 38% increase during the war. Fuel and electricity up 8.5%. Here's one of the biggest gainers, clothing. The spending on clothing increased 56% during the war. Why? Because all the materials were being used to make uniforms for the troops. So clothing became very expensive. So naturally, people bought less clothing. Well, what happened to all the stores? What happened to all the clothing stores when no one is buying clothes? Did anybody during World War II, did FDR say, we're going to bail out all the companies, all the bars, all the restaurants that are seeing a big decline in their businesses? Don't worry, you don't have to lay anybody off. We're going to bail you out. If you're having trouble paying your rent, we're going to make sure to cover that. Nobody is going to lose anything. You know, if you have to stay at home and take care of your kids, don't worry, we're going to cover your child care. You know what happened during the Second World War when so many men went off to fight the war? Their wives went to work in a factory. Nobody talked about giving child care to the kids. Look, that was a real emergency, real national sacrifice where the government called on the rugged individuals that used to populate our country, real Americans, and said, you know what? This is a national emergency, and I know it's going to be painful. People are going to lose money. Businesses are going to lose sales. People are going to lose their jobs. But you know what? We're all in this together. We're going to pull together, and we're going to fight World War II. Can you imagine, again, if FDR said nobody has to sacrifice, nobody has to pay higher taxes to fight World War II? In fact, we're going to cut your taxes while we're fighting World War II. Nobody has to buy any war bonds. I mean, the crazy thing is, not only is the government not saying that it needs to borrow money from the public, the government is saying it's going to loan money to the public. As it's cutting its taxes and reducing its revenue, it's promising loans. It's promising to guarantee loans. It's promising to bail out all these companies. I mean, today the president announced that they're going to bail out the airlines, like a $50 billion bailout. The president said, it's not their fault that we have the coronavirus. Look, the coronavirus isn't their fault, but the fact that they levered up so much and they bought back all this overpriced stock, whose fault is that? Why didn't they have reserves for a rainy day like companies did going into the Second World War? Why is everybody so levered up? No one forced them to do that. Now, again, if you want to blame anybody other than the airline executives, right, themselves, or the stockholders for being asleep at the switch, or the bondholders, we can blame the Fed. The Fed levered everybody up by keeping interest rates artificially low. The government, bailed out other industries in the past. What should we do with the airlines? Let them fail. Let them go bankrupt. Now, it's not like there won't be any planes. Just like if we had not bailed out the banks and let them fail, the banks don't go away. What happens is smarter, more prudent people take over. That's what would happen if we let the airlines go bankrupt. Somebody would come in and buy up the planes and run the airlines, but do it in a more responsible way, knowing that if they failed, they wouldn't get bailed out either. But if we keep bailing out companies that take on too much leverage, well, then that's going to continue to happen. Just like I said before, these banks are going to fail again. All the banks that were too big to fail are much bigger now, and they're still going to fail. And now it's going to cost even more money to bail them out. Had we not bailed them out the first time, they'd be in much better shape right now. But the even crazier part of the whole thing is when everybody is saying that the government has to make everybody whole, right? The government has to, stop taxation, suspend taxation, and start sending money, right? Putting money in the pockets of the American people. All of a sudden, Andrew Yang's $1,000 a month for every American. They're talking about that, right? They're literally talking about dropping money from helicopters. In fact, people are saying, let's drop money from helicopters, and they somehow think that's a good thing. Look, if we could have done that, why didn't FDR do that during World War II? Why didn't FDR just say, hey, we're going to give everybody a tax cut. We're going to bail everybody out. We don't want anybody to suffer from World War II, and we're just going to pay for World War II by printing money. They had a Federal Reserve back then. I mean, they could have just said, hey, Fed, we need money for bombers and tanks and planes, so print up a bunch of money. If FDR had the same fiscal and monetary policies in 1941 that we're advising now, we'd all be speaking German now. We would have lost that war. We couldn't have fought any of that war. The only reason we were able to win the war is because the private sector freed up resources and made those resources available to the government. So they stopped consuming, they stopped spending, and they saved more, and they loaned their savings to the government to free up resources to fight the war. What resources is the government asking Americans to free up now? None. The government is claiming that it's going to shower everybody with money. Where is it coming from? The government doesn't have any way to get money but for the people.